May 5th, 1945. The war in Europe is already over. Everyone knows it. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. And yet, in the Austrian Alps, American soldiers are about to fight the strangest battle of World War II, standing shoulder to shoulder with German soldiers against other Germans. This is not a mistake. This is not a rumor. This is documented in official army reports. On one side, a handful of exhausted American tank crews. On the other, fanatical SS troops still fighting a war that no longer exists. And in between, wearing German uniforms, holding German rifles, fighting for the Americans, regular Wehrmacht soldiers. The enemy from the day before. An American captain named John Lee wrote about that morning with a kind of disbelief that still reads strange today. He had fought across France. He had survived the Bulge. He had crossed the Rhine. And nothing in his training prepared him to give orders to German soldiers and have them obey. Battle of Castle Itter. The only time in American military history that U.S. forces fought alongside German troops against a common enemy. It happened inside a medieval castle in the mountains. It happened on the very last day of the war. And it involved a group of prisoners so famous, so politically explosive, that the SS had orders to execute all of them rather than let them be found alive. Inside those stone walls sat the sister of Charles de Gaulle, two former prime ministers of France, two French generals blamed for the fall of their own country, a Wimbledon tennis champion, all of them locked in the same castle, waiting to find out if they would survive the war or die in its final hours. One German officer changed everything. A Wehrmacht major who spent a year secretly turning against his own regime, risking his life every single day to pass information to the resistance. Made a choice that would put him on the wrong side of his own uniform and the right side of history. What happened next has almost no equivalent in the entire war. A German officer walking through the dark to find American soldiers. A tank commander deciding, without permission, without a manual, without any precedent, to trust him. And 3 hours of fighting inside a castle that should never have become a battlefield, between men who 2 days earlier were trying to kill each other. Stay until the end, because the way this battle finished, and who survived it and who didn't, tells you something about war that the clean version of history never mentions. To understand how a medieval castle became the site of the strangest battle of the war, you have to go back further than the fighting itself. Because Castle Itter was not a battlefield by accident. Before anyone could have imagined it. The Schloss Itter sits on a rocky outcrop in the Austrian Tyrol, built in the 12th century. Thick stone walls, one narrow road leading up to the gate, a position that looks down over the entire valley. It was designed to be defended, and that design would matter more than anyone at the time could have guessed. In 1943, the SS took it over. They turned it into something the Nazi regime called a facility for Ehrenhäftling, honor prisoners. That word deserves attention because it tells you exactly how the regime saw these people. Too valuable to simply execute, too dangerous to ever set free. So they were kept, isolated, in a castle in the mountains, cut off from the world. The people held inside were not ordinary prisoners. They were, by any measure, the wreckage of a nation's leadership. Of German captivity by the time she arrived. General Maxime Weygand, once the supreme commander of French forces, sat in one of those stone rooms, a man whose decisions in 1940 had shaped the collapse of his own country. Paul Reynaud, the last prime minister of the French Third Republic, paced those same corridors. He was the man who had refused to sign the armistice with Germany and had been arrested for it. And a few doors down, was Édouard Daladier, the prime minister who had signed the Munich Agreement back in 1938, now a prisoner of the very regime he had once tried to appease. General Gustave Gamelin was there too, the commander blamed for France falling in 6 weeks. He occupied a cell 3 floors from the man who had replaced him. Even in captivity, the rivalries followed them. A tennis champion named Jean Borotra, once a Wimbledon winner, was held in the same castle. 12 years later. Think about what that room must have felt like. These were not anonymous victims. They had failed, publicly, spectacularly, in the most consequential moment of French history in living memory. And now they were locked together, waiting. One German guard, a young officer, left behind a rare account of what those final months were like inside the castle walls. He said the atmosphere was electric with fear. He said the prisoners argued constantly, generals blaming politicians, politicians blaming generals. And then he admitted something startling. He said that listening to them, he sometimes thought France had lost the war in those very rooms, long before a single tank crossed into Belgium. That single observation tells you something important. These prisoners were not just victims of German aggression. Helped cause the disaster they were now trapped inside. And in a matter of days, all of them were about to be handed one final chance, not to fix the past, but simply to survive it. By late April 1945, 2 men were moving toward the same conclusion from completely different directions, and neither of them knew the other existed. The first was a prisoner, though not one of the famous ones. Zvonimir Kukovic, known to everyone as Zvonko, was a Yugoslav soccer player who had ended up working inside the castle's orbit, half laborer, half servant to the political prisoners. His status was unclear, but that ambiguity gave him something valuable. He could move. He could leave. As American artillery began echoing through the Alpine valleys in the final days of April, Zvonko became the prisoner's only link to the outside world. No map, no weapon, no protection, just a message and a direction to walk. The second man was the one who would change everything, and he was wearing a German uniform. Major Josef Gangl had spent the final year of the war fighting a private battle no one around him could see. He was not a natural rebel. He was a professional soldier, a man who had believed in Germany, if not in Hitler, and who had earned his rank through years of competent service. The Eastern Front changed him. He saw enough there to understand that the war was not just lost, it was wrong. By late 1944, he was secretly in contact with Austrian resistance cells, passing intelligence, quietly undermining SS supply lines in ways that could not yet be traced back to him. Every day, he gave orders in the name of a regime he had already decided to betray. Had turned into something close to chaos, not from Allied bombing, but from within. Isolated SS units, cut off from any real command, were executing civilians accused of defeatism. Deserters were being hanged with cardboard signs around their necks. The regime was consuming itself in one last spasm of violence before it disappeared completely. And Gangl learned something that made all of this personal. An order had come through that the prisoners at Castle Itter were to be executed before American forces could reach them. No witnesses, no trophies for the enemy. A Waffen-SS unit was already moving toward the castle to carry it out. Gangl made his decision in that moment. He would find the Americans himself. He was not the only one racing toward that outcome. Could immediately read, and the man who would receive both of them, the prisoner's plea and the German officer's warning, was not a general with a division behind him. He was a 23-year-old tank company commander named John Lee, the kind of officer history almost forgets, except for what happened next. When Zvonko reached an American checkpoint on the evening of May 4th, half collapsed, speaking broken German and fragments of English, Lee was the one called in. He listened. He looked at the letter he could not read. And then, hours later, when a German major appeared out of the darkness under an improvised white flag, offering not just information but his own soldiers and his own life, Lee had to decide something no training had ever prepared him for. Trust him or turn him away. Cut through the dark. Lee spoke no German. Gangl spoke almost no English. The only bridge between them was a Wehrmacht soldier who had once worked in a hotel in Switzerland and remembered just enough of both languages to translate, terrified in the middle of the night, for two officers who had been enemies 12 hours earlier. Lee later wrote that the entire meeting felt completely unreal. A German officer, still in uniform, was offering to fight beside American troops. Not just information, his own men, his own weapons, his own life. There was no manual for this. No training exercise had ever covered it. Lee looked at the man across from him, decided he was telling the truth, and said yes. They drove to the castle together before sunrise. What Lee found at dawn was not a fortress. Thin. One Sherman tank, commanded by a sergeant named Kurt Schrader, had barely made it up the narrow mountain road, a handful of American infantry. Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers, armed with standard rifles and submachine guns. The castle's Austrian caretaker, who knew every corridor by memory. And the prisoners themselves. Some of those prisoners made a decision that surprised even them. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, had already slipped out of the castle overnight, running through the mountains in the dark to find more help. General Gamelin, old and unwell, asked Lee for a weapon. Paul Renault organized the non-fighters into shelter. Men who had spent years arguing over whose fault France's collapse had been were suddenly in complete agreement about one thing. They were not going quietly. The SS arrived around 9 in the morning. One anti-tank weapon, and they expected to find the castle defenseless. Instead, they found a Sherman tank blocking the gate and gunfire coming from the walls. The first assault was pushed back. The tank fired twice, and the sound rolled through the valley so loudly that villagers below thought the mountains themselves were collapsing. Inside, things were already turning desperate. By mid-morning, an anti-tank round tore through Schrader's Sherman. The tank stopped moving, but its gun still worked, and Schrader, bleeding from his arm, climbed back inside and kept firing. Gangl moved along the walls the entire time, calm in a way several witnesses later found almost eerie. He was not performing loyalty to anyone. He was simply doing the thing in front of him, which was keeping these people alive. Around 10:30, a bullet found him. Regime died defending its former prisoners on a castle wall, fighting beside Americans and French generals in a battle that history would not officially acknowledge for decades. Borotra was still running. The tennis champion who had slipped out of the castle in the dark had not stopped moving all morning. through mountain paths, past a German patrol he somehow talked his way around, until he finally reached another American column. The message he carried, urgent and clear, moved up the chain fast enough that a relief force was already speeding toward the castle while the battle still raged. It arrived around noon. A larger American armored unit came up the road below Castle Itter and hit the SS detachment from behind. The fight was over in minutes. And the prisoners were free. There was a photograph from that afternoon. American soldiers, former prisoners, some still wearing the same worn clothes they had lived in for years, and standing among them, if you look closely, Wehrmacht soldiers, the men who had spent the morning firing beside the Americans, now standing in the same courtyard, under the same sky, in a silence that none of them had trained for. Captain Lee said something years later that has stayed with people who study this battle. He said he expected liberation to feel clean, a clear line between victory and defeat. Instead, it felt messier than that, and far more human. Looking at Gangl's body, and then at the people Gangl had died protecting, he understood for the first time that this war had never just been between nations. It had been a war inside them, too. In 1940, spent the rest of their lives facing tribunals, memoirs, and arguments that never fully let them go. Marie-Agnès Caillou returned to her family and lived quietly, almost entirely out of the public record of what she had survived. Borotra's own wartime record stayed complicated, the night run through the mountains sitting uneasily beside other choices he had made in other years. Sergeant Schrader, who kept firing from a wrecked tank with a wounded arm, received a Silver Star. Josef Gangl was posthumously honored as an Austrian resistance hero. There is a street named after him near the village below the castle, and a memorial that most visitors walk past without knowing what happened there. For decades, almost no one talked about this battle at all. Not because the army hid it, but because it simply did not fit anywhere. Not a single hour of it. John Lee lived a long life after the war. In the rare interviews he gave, he stayed modest about all of it. He said he made the decision he made because it seemed right in the moment, not because he knew it would work. He simply did not see another choice standing in front of him that night. We tell the story of this war through clean lines most of the time. One side right, one side wrong, victory earned and deserved. That version is true and it matters, but it is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes a German officer who served a terrible cause honorably until the moment he found a better one, and died proving it. It includes French generals who helped lose a war in 1940 and picked up rifles to survive one 5 years later. They wrote years afterward about the moment the gunfire finally stopped, standing in the castle courtyard with an American soldier on one side of him and a German soldier on the other, all three looking down at the smoke rising from the valley. He said he had a thought he was almost ashamed to admit. He thought that this strange, unplanned, impossible alliance was exactly what peace was going to feel like. Not clean, not simple. Just people choosing at the very last second to stand on the same side.